You are standing on a hillside, and the day is almost gone. The light is the kind that comes only at this hour. The pale, slanting, honey-colored light that pulls the green out of the leaves and leaves them grey. You can hear, from somewhere in the next valley, the small, dry sound of a branch moving in a way no wind would move it. The breeze is settled. The trees are settled. Something living is in the next valley, and it is not you. There is a fire down there. You did not build it. You can smell it now, faintly, the way smoke travels when the air begins to cool that thin grey thread that finds its way through the trees long before you ever see the flame. Someone has lit a fire on the other side of the ridge. Someone is keeping it going. They have chosen that spot and gathered the wood and held the spark, and the small bright work of keeping a fire alive in the open is something they know how to do. They know it the way you know how to find the light switch in your own hallway in the dark. The hillside is quiet. The grass is bending low. You stand a little longer than you mean to, listening. The bird that was calling a few minutes ago has stopped. The deer that crossed the path further down has gone wherever it went. There is just the breathing of the wood, the small settling of the day into evening, and the smoke. You think the world has always held only one kind of person, one species, walking around, one way of being upright, of having hands, of carrying language, and a soft pink mouth, and a memory of yesterday. You think the loneliness of it is normal, and that being the only thinking creature on the planet is just how being alive works. You think you know what a human is, because there is only one kind, and it is you, and the people in the next valley, and the people on the other side of the world. You are wrong about this, and the wrongness is older and stranger than you might be ready for. For most of the last 2 million years, this planet has not held one kind of human. It has held several, all at once, walking the same valleys, drawing breath off the same air. The forest you are standing in some other century, has watched several different kinds of person come up the same path, light fires in slightly different ways, hold their tools at slightly different angles, and look at one another across a thinning tree line. We have never been alone until we were, and the aloneness is recent. 8 other human species, that is the count, not one other, not 2. 8 distinct lineages of upright, fire-keeping, tool-carrying people who shared this earth with us, or who walked it shortly before us. 8 different solutions to the same long problem of being a primate that could not, at some point in the deep past, climb back into the trees. 8 different bodies, 8 different brains, 8 different ways of waiting out a winter, or burying a dead child, or breaking a bone to get at the marrow inside. As recently as 60,000 years ago, which is no time at all in geological terms, no time at all, at least 5 of those species were alive at the same moment. Sapiens in Africa, beginning to walk out into the rest of the world. Neanderthals in the cold valleys of Europe and the Levant. Denisovans somewhere across the great breadth of Asia, from Siberia to the Tibetan high plateau. The small people of Flores, on their island in what is now Indonesia, watching dwarf elephants come down to drink, and the last of the long-running species, Homo erectus, in the rainforest margins of Java, holding on at the very end of a story that had already lasted nearly 2 million years. 5 kinds of person, the same evening, the same earth. You can let that sit, while the smoke from the fire in the next valley keeps rising, and the breeze keeps not coming, and the day keeps drawing back. There were others, in those long evenings of the deep past. The hill you are standing on, in some other century, would not have been your hill alone. The valley below would not have been a quiet, settled, finished thing. There would have been other smoke, on other ridges, made by other hands. Some of those hands would have looked very like yours. Some would not. Some would have held the same kind of stone tool in the same kind of way. Some would have held a slightly different kind of tool, with a slightly different grip, for a slightly different cut. You have been told, often without anyone meaning to tell you, that being human means being a sapiens, that the family tree of our kind is a single trunk going down into the past, and that everything else is a side branch, a curiosity, a footnote, the textbooks like a tidy lineage, the diagrams like a single line. It is easier to draw and easier to remember, and it makes the present feel inevitable. But the present is not inevitable. The present is the strange, narrow corridor at the end of a much wider hall. For nearly all of human time, the hall was full. There were many kinds of us, in many places, doing many things. The corridor we are walking down now alone, on this version of the earth, is the historical anomaly. It is the freak condition, not the rule. Sit with that for a moment, while the smoke from the fire in the next valley keeps coming up between the trees. The corridor we are walking down now is narrow and quiet, and the walls of it are very close. The hall behind us, when you turn around, is wider than you can see. There were many lights in that hall once, many fires, many evenings, in many countries, with many different kinds of breath rising into the cold air. It helps to put two numbers next to one another. You can read them slowly. There is no rush. Homo erectus walked the earth for something like 1.9 million years. Walked out of Africa before any other kind of human had managed it. Reached the Caucasus by something like 1.8 million years ago. Reached Java, possibly crossed water to reach Flores. Made stone tools that would have been recognizable to a craftsman 100,000 generations later. Kept going, and kept going, and kept going. Sapiens, that is. You, and the person sleeping a few rooms away from you, and everyone you have ever loved, has so far existed for about 300,000 years. 1.9,300,000. Read those two numbers again, if you like. There is something in the difference between them that is worth letting settle. Erectus lasted more than 6 times longer than we have lasted so far. Erectus was the long survivor, the deep-time success story. We are the newcomers. We happen to be the last ones still in the room. That is a different thing from being the best. You have been told, in 100 small ways, that we won, that our cleverness ran the others out, that the Neanderthals were too slow, the Floresiensis too small, the erectus too primitive, the others not quite enough. The story has a pleasant shape because the storyteller is one of us. Heroic shapes are easy to draw when you are inside the hero, but the more carefully the bones are read, the less heroic the story gets. We did not outthink them in any miracle way. We were not, in any meaningful sense, smarter. We were just luckier and more numerous, and we walked into their valleys at the worst moments of their climate. We absorbed them more often than we replaced them. Every non-African listener tonight is carrying somewhere between 1.5% and 2% of their genome from the Neanderthals, the people we are supposed to have beaten. The Denisovans, who have no formal name even now, left up to 5% of their genome inside the people of Papua and Aboriginal Australia. The high-altitude gene that allows Tibetans to live above 13,000 feet without the air feeling thin. That gene is a clean inheritance from a kind of person whose face we have only just begun to glimpse. The other humans did not simply vanish. Some of them are still here, folded inside the bodies of the people listening, riding inside the immune system, the lung function, the skin, the hair. We did not survive them. We carry them. That is where this is going. But it is going to take a while to get there, because the story is older than any of the names we have for it, and the bones it is built out of are scattered across half of the world, and a great deal of what they tell us has only been worked out in the last 20 or 30 years. The picture is still being assembled. New finds, every few seasons, shift the edges of it. Some of what was solid a generation ago has gone soft. Some of what was wild speculation a generation ago has been confirmed. Be patient with the picture. It is the picture of your own deeper family, and it deserves to be looked at slowly. But to get there, you have to walk back through the small, recent corridor of being only sapiens, back through the long blur of ice ages, of advancing and retreating glaciers, of cold steppes and warm forests, trading places across the same continent every 20,000 years. Back to a time when the 8 other kinds of person were not yet 8, but several. Back further still, before the Neanderthals had become Neanderthals, before the Denisovans had branched off, before the small people of Flores had even got onto their island. Back to a quiet stretch of European time, nearly 1 million years ago, where the family tree of our kind first comes faintly into focus. So sit, if you are sitting. Lie down, if you are already lying down. The fire in the next valley can keep itself, for now. We are going to walk a long way, slowly, toward the people we used to be, and the people who used to be alongside us, and the further back we go, the quieter it gets. The first place we are going is a coast. It is a coast that does not exist anymore. If you stood on it now, you would be standing in cold grey water, somewhere off the east of England, with the North Sea breaking around your knees. But 900,000 years ago, this was dry land, and it was the edge of a wide estuary, and a slow river, what is now called the Thames, although the river then ran through a different country, was emptying itself out into a bay full of salt marsh and mud flats and flocks of birds that no one alive has ever seen. The mud here is soft, fine, grey, a little blue where the water has just left it, the kind of mud that holds an impression for a season and then is gone. A small group is walking along the edge of it, 5 of them. We know there are 5 because there are 5 sets of footprints, and we know there are footprints because in the spring of 2013, on the modern beach at Heidelbergensis in Norfolk, on the east coast of England, the tide pulled away the upper sand and exposed a patch of much older estuarine silt, and pressed into the silt were the prints of feet, some smaller, some larger, a family group, probably, walking south, along the edge of the water. The prints were photographed, scanned, 3-dimensionally recorded as quickly as the team could work, because they were already disappearing. Within 2 weeks, the same tide that had uncovered them had washed them away again. The footprints had survived 900,000 years in the silt and could not survive the spring of 2013 on a beach in Norfolk. You can hold that in your hand for a moment, the way you would hold a small, fragile object. 900,000 years. The mud took a record of 5 people walking south one afternoon and kept that record untouched, while the climates of the world cycled through ice age and warm interval and ice age again, while the river they were walking beside changed its course several times, while the sea rose and fell and rose and fell, while the entire animal life of Britain turned over twice. The mud kept the record, and the year the mud finally let it go was the same year a small team of British archaeologists happened to be looking at the right beach, on the right tide, at the right grey afternoon, a few weeks earlier or a few weeks later, and no one alive would ever have known the walkers were there. These are the oldest known human footprints outside of Africa. The walkers were probably not us, and probably not Neanderthals, and probably not Denisovans. The most likely candidate, given the time and the place and the shape of the feet, is a species called Homo antecessor, which means, roughly, the human who came before. Antecessor is a quiet, half-known species. Most of what we know about them comes from one site, in northern Spain, in a long limestone gorge called the Sierra de Atapuerca. There, in a cave called Gran Dolina, in a level of sediment numbered TD6, the bones of at least 6 individuals have been recovered over the years since 1994. The most famous of them is the partial face of a child, a juvenile who lived and died around 800,000 years ago, and whose face, when you look at it, is unsettlingly modern. The cheekbones are flat, the mid-face is delicate, almost like ours. The brow above is heavy and archaic. The body, where the body has been recovered, is robust, with the proportions of an early human still close to its African origins. Their brains were a little smaller than yours. Their tools were simple flakes of stone, struck off larger cores in the older Mode 1 manner. They lived through long, cold winters in a Europe that was not yet locked into deep ice ages, but was already cooling, already turning into the kind of place where being human meant being prepared. And in that level of sediment at Gran Dolina, alongside the bones of the antecessor children and adults, there are cut marks, stone tool cut marks, made not on animal bone, but on the bones of the antecessor themselves. It is the oldest unambiguous evidence of cannibalism in Europe, the kind of detail that, told quickly, sounds like horror. But there is no horror in it, if you let it sit for a moment, or at least no more horror than is in any of the long, slow, hungry winters of the deep past. They were a creature doing what creatures do in a world that had not yet invented the rules you and your neighbors later invented for yourselves. The bones tell us only that the bodies of Antecessor were processed in the same way the bodies of the deer and the horses were processed. Whether that meant survival, or ritual, or grief, or something for which we have no word, the bones do not say. The bones never say. For a long time, Antecessor was thought to be the common ancestor, the species, perhaps, that gave rise to the Neanderthals on one branch and to us on the other. The name itself, the human who came before, was meant to suggest exactly that role. But in 2020, a paper in Nature changed the picture, gently. A team had managed to recover ancient proteins from the enamel of an antecessor. Tooth proteins are tougher than DNA. They last longer. They survive in places where DNA cannot. The proteins were sequenced. The sequence was compared to the sequences of later humans, and it turned out that Antecessor was not our ancestor at all. Antecessor was a cousin, a sister branch, a near miss. Close enough to share many of the same features, far enough away that the line which led to us and to the Neanderthals and to the Denisovans ran past them rather than through them. The actual common ancestor of sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovans is somewhere a little later in time, somewhere a little further along the trunk of the tree. Antecessor walked off to one side and ended. Some researchers still argue about the exact placement. Others say the proteins are clear. Either way, it is a useful correction. The tree of human evolution is not a ladder going up. It is a tangled, low, dense shrub. Most of the branches end, Almost every kind of human who has ever lived is gone. The branch you are sitting on, listening to this, that branch is the unusual one, because it is the one still growing. Sit with that, while the mud at Happisburg dries, and the wind off the estuary moves through the reeds, and the 5 walkers, whoever they were, keep walking south. In your mind, along a coast that no longer exists. They never looked back. They had no reason to. They did not know your name, or that you would one day stand on the same ground, in a different country, listening to their story. They were just walking south, in the cold afternoon, the way you might walk anywhere. Time slides forward, 500,000 years, maybe a little less. The footprints at Happisburg are long gone, ground back into ocean silt. The Antecessor at Atapuerca have died and been replaced by their descendants, or by newcomers, or by some braid of the two. The world keeps cooling and warming, the great northern ice sheet advancing and retreating like a slow tide. And on the European mainland, in central Germany, in a place that will one day be called Schöningen, a group of humans is hunting horses by a lakeshore. The lake is shallow and reedy. The horses come down to drink. The hunters wait, in the reeds, in small numbers, maybe 3, maybe 5. They have spears. The spears are not flint-tipped. The spears are made of spruce wood, carefully selected, carefully shaped. The point is hardened in a fire and worked to a needle-fine taper. The balance is set by trial and error, and a kind of working knowledge that has been passed down for many generations just behind the center of the shaft, so that the spear can be thrown. The spears are about 300,000 years old, give or take. They were found at Schöningen in a peat layer in the 1990s, perfectly preserved by the wet, anaerobic conditions of a buried lakebed. 8 of them, plus a throwing stick. They are, as of when this is being told, the oldest complete wooden hunting weapons known anywhere on Earth. Wood, in normal conditions, does not last. Wood rots. Wood feeds the soil. The fact that you have these spears to look at all is a small miracle of geology. A lake that closed over the spot at the right moment, a layer of peat that sealed the wood off from oxygen, a slow burial that asked no questions of the artifact for 300 millennia. And then, in the late 20th century, a coal mining operation in the Helmstedt district peeled back enough of the upper sediment to bring archaeologists in. And the archaeologists were careful, and the spears came out of the peat almost dark and almost whole. You can picture them, if you like, long, slim, heavier at the front, the grain of the wood still visible in places where the conservators have stabilized it. Tools made by people who understood the springiness of spruce and the difference between a thrusting weapon and a throwing one. Tools that show, by their very existence, that the makers were thinking about something they could not yet see about the horse that might come down to the water in 2 days' time, about the angle they would need to be at when it did, about the wind and the cover and the weight of the spear in the throwing hand. They were planning the future in a way that very few animals on this planet plan the future. Whoever made them was a kind of human we tend to call, with some uneasiness, Homo Heidelbergensis. The species was named in 1908 from a single jawbone found in a sand pit near the German town of Mauer. Near Heidelberg, a jawbone large and chinless and unmistakably human. But unlike any modern jaw, the species, since then, has been used as a label for a wide grade of large, robust, big-brained humans living across Africa and Europe between roughly 700,000 and 200,000 years ago. Whether they really were one species, or whether the label has been stretched too thin, is a real argument among the people who study them. Some researchers want to split them into one species in Africa, another in Europe, perhaps a third somewhere in between. Others want to keep the wider net. The argument is not yet settled. For the purposes of this telling, you can hold the name lightly, like a placeholder. What matters is the kind of person they were, and what they did, and what came out of them later. What they did, among other things, was make the spears at Schöningen and use them well. The bones of horses are scattered around the same site, butchered with stone tools, carried away in pieces. This is organized hunting, planned in advance, executed by a group against an animal far larger than any of the hunters. It is not opportunistic scavenging, it is a strategy. What they did, also, was something far stranger, something we still cannot fully explain. In the same Sierra de Atapuerca, not far from the Grandolina cave where the Antecessor children were found, there is another cave. It is harder to get into. The way in is a narrow shaft that drops, almost vertically, 13 meters into the dark. At the bottom of the shaft is a chamber. The chamber is small and damp and entirely without light. It is called the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones. In that chamber, 430,000 years ago or thereabouts, the bodies of at least 28 human individuals were placed, or thrown, or carried, somehow, down the shaft and into the dark. Men, women, children, adolescents. Their bones lie mixed together at the bottom of the pit, in conditions that have preserved them well enough that genetic material has, in recent years, been recovered from some of them. No one knows, fully, why they are there. The chamber was not a living space. There is no sign of a hearth, no scatter of tools. The animal bones in the chamber are mostly cave bare. Whatever the people of Cima de los Huesos were doing with their dead, they were doing it deliberately, and they were doing it in a place no one had any other reason to go. You can stand at the top of that shaft, in your mind, and look down. You can imagine the shaft. The drop is 13 meters of cold, narrow, black space. The carrying of a body, in the dark, by torchlight or by the dim red of a small firebrand, would have been difficult, frightening work. There is no easy way to do it. There is no purpose to doing it that a hungry, practical, exhausted small group could have explained in modern terms. And yet, over a long span of time, not a single event, but many depositions. Across generations, the bodies kept coming. 28 individuals at the last count, men and women, adolescents, a child of 7 or 8. They are mixed together at the bottom, where the chamber widens slightly, where the floor is uneven, where time has done its slow work on the bones. They have been there for more than 400 millennia. This is, on the most cautious reading, the oldest possible evidence of funerary behavior anywhere in the world, the oldest sign of the very simple, very human idea that the dead need to be put somewhere, that you do not just leave them. The bodies of Cima are not necessarily a burial in the sense we use the word. There are no grave goods. There is no obvious ceremony. There is just the choice, made by whoever was alive then, to take their dead down a shaft in the dark and leave them. The interpretation is contested and should be contested. Some researchers see the pit as a deliberate funerary site. Others see it as a natural accumulation or a more practical kind of disposal. The bones cannot quite tell us. What the bones can tell us, what the recent ancient DNA work on them has now told us, is that the people of Cima de los Huesos were not classic Heidelbergensis at all in genetic terms. They sit cleanly on the Neanderthal lineage. They are, in the language of the molecules, early Neanderthals. The split has already happened by then. The branch leading to the cold-built people of Ice Age Europe has already broken away. Which brings us, gently, to the great quiet truth at the center of this stretch of deep time. Heidelbergensis, in whichever way you want to use the name, is the great ancestor factory. It is the grade of human from which the later kinds emerge. In Africa, one population of these big-bodied, big-brained, spear-making, fire-keeping people drifts and adapts over hundreds of thousands of years and slowly becomes us, becomes Homo sapiens, walks out of Africa eventually, in waves, and meets what is left of its cousins. In Eurasia, a different population of these same kinds of people drifts and adapts in different conditions, and slowly becomes the Neanderthals. And, on a more easterly branch of the same tree, becomes a sister lineage that we are only just beginning to understand, a people we will call, for now, the Denisovans. Although the name is provisional, and the arguments about what to actually call them are still going on, the family is splitting. It is splitting in the way most family splits actually happen, not at any single moment, not because of any single argument, but slowly, over the course of generations, that none of the people involved would have noticed at the time. A grandmother in a southern Spanish cave 450,000 years ago would have looked at her granddaughter and seen a granddaughter the way you would look at yours. The slow accumulation of the cold adapted features that we now call Neanderthal did not arrive in any one generation. It arrived in tiny increments across 1,000 grandmothers and 1,000 granddaughters, in valleys getting colder and game getting harder to find. The same is true of the population in Africa that was, in its own slow, unwitnessed way, becoming us. It is not, when you watch it from far enough away, a rupture. It is a long, quiet drifting apart. A population in southern Europe, finding itself in colder winters than its grandparents knew, starts to grow shorter limbs and a barrel chest. A population in the south of Africa, finding itself in long warm seasons, stays leaner. A population in Central Asia, in lands you cannot quite see from here, becomes something we will not formally identify until the year 2010, when a single fingertip-sized piece of bone gives away their existence. The branches are pulling away from one another, in different countries, in different climates, over the course of 100,000 years, 200,000 years, more, and the world keeps cooling and warming. The ice keeps coming and going. The forest in some valleys closes up. The steppe in some valleys opens out. The animals shift their ranges. The rivers move. The smoke from a small group's evening fire rises through the trees on the side of a hill that, in 100,000 years, will not even be a hill anymore. One of those branches drifts west, drifts deeper into Europe, drifts further into the cold than any other kind of human has ever lived. Their bodies thicken. Their faces lengthen at the middle, as if reaching out to take in more of the cold air, to warm it before it hits the lungs. Their brows grow heavy and double-arched. Their brains grow larger, on average, than yours. They become very specific, very local, very well suited to a world you would never have survived in. And they live, in that world, for hundreds of thousands of years before any of us turn up. They watch the ice come down and watch it pull back. They learn the rhythms of a continent you would not recognize, a continent of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and cave lion, of long winters in valleys we now call France and Spain and Croatia, of summers brief enough to count. And it is to them, now, that you are going to walk, slowly, the way they walked. Out of the Spanish caves and into the long, low, stone-shadowed valleys of Ice Age Europe, toward a fire built deep in the dark of a cave that had no business being lit, toward a body laid carefully on its side, with something perhaps only flowers, perhaps not, no one is sure, placed near it, toward a kind of person we have, until very recently, told entirely the wrong story about, toward the Neanderthals. Picture a valley in what is now the south of France. The trees have closed in over the lip of a hillside that, from far enough away, looks like nothing at all. There is a river somewhere down at the bottom, and the slow sound of it is what you can hear, faintly, even from up here. There are no fields, there are no roads, there is only forest, and the long, low slopes of limestone, and the breath of someone walking up the hill ahead of you with a torch. The person walking ahead of you is not you. The person walking ahead of you is a Neanderthal. You should pause for a moment on what that word actually means before you go any further. For a long time, in the imagination of the people who came after them, the Neanderthals were the shorthand for a kind of failure, the brutish cousin, the slow one, the one who could not keep up. You will have inherited that picture from somewhere, even if you cannot remember where, from a cartoon as a child, from a phrase used as an insult, from an old textbook diagram in which a stooped, hairy figure walks behind an upright one toward a horizon that he will not reach. You can feel that shape sitting somewhere in the back of your mind. It is not a true shape. It has been wrong for at least 50 years, and it is still wrong now, and the version of them that is closer to true is, in almost every way, a more interesting kind of person to walk behind into a cave. The Neanderthal walking ahead of you on this hillside is shorter than you and broader. You can see that even by the small, jumping light of the torch. He is somewhere around 5.5 feet tall, and his shoulders are wider than yours, and his chest is a deeper barrel than yours. His arms are heavier. His legs are shorter at the lower bone, the way the legs of people who live in cold places very often are, the body keeping its heat closer in by giving the wind less to scour. His face, when he turns, is heavier in the brow than the face you see in your bathroom mirror. The brow ridge sits forward, a kind of double arch over the eyes, and the cheekbones are pulled back in a way that makes the whole front of the face seem to project, just slightly, out into the cold. His nose is large, larger than yours. The nose, in cold air, is doing useful work warming and humidifying every breath before it reaches the lung. His brain, inside that long, low skull, is on average larger than yours, not by much, but by enough that it is worth saying out loud, since you grew up being told the opposite. The shape is different. The brain is pulled longer, front to back, where yours is more domed, but the volume is there. Whatever you might want to say about these people, you cannot say that they were short on brain. You follow him into the cave. The mouth of it is low, and you have to stoop to get under the lip. The torch he is carrying makes a small bubble of warm light around him, and inside that bubble you can see the limestone walls passing pale, damp, scored here and there by the slow lines of old water. The air goes still. The river noise from outside falls away. There is the small wet sound of his boot on the cave floor, and the dry crackle of the torch, and otherwise nothing. You walk for a long time. The cave does not open out into anything dramatic. It threads, it narrows. You pass between the walls, and then under a low ceiling that he has to duck for, and then through a long, slow chamber where the floor is uneven and you have to feel your way with your feet. You cannot tell, from inside it, how far down into the hill you have walked. You only know that you have left the daylight far behind you. The daylight is gone. There is only the torch and the sound of his breathing and yours. And then you arrive somewhere. The chamber opens out gently into a wider space. The torch lifts. The light moves over the walls and over the floor, and what you see in that moving light is a circle, a ring of stalagmite, broken, carried in, stacked. Someone, not him, not now, but someone, a long time before any of this, has gone into the deeper part of the cave with a stone and has broken off the long, finger-like stalagmites that grow up from the cave floor. They have carried them in pieces back to this chamber. They have laid them down in a circle, 2 circles, in fact, side by side, with smaller stacks of broken stalagmite balanced on top like little walls. There is the burnt residue of small fires inside the rings and on the stones themselves. There is no obvious reason for any of it. The chamber is more than 300 meters in from the cave mouth. There is no daylight here. There is no living to be done here. No one is sheltering in it. No one is hunting in it. No one has any practical reason at all to come this far into the cold and the dark, and arrange a thing like this. The cave is called Bruniquel. The structure was found, properly studied, in the south of France. And when researchers finally got a date out of it, by measuring the slow regrowth of calcite over the broken edges of the stalagmite, the date came back at 176,000 years before the present. 176,000 years. That is older than your species was in any number that scientists are confident about. In Europe, there were no Homo sapiens in that valley at that time. There was no one in that valley at that time who could have made that ring, except for a Neanderthal. You stand in the chamber and let that sit on you for a moment. 300 meters into a cave, in the dark, by torchlight, 170,000 years before any of your ancestors got within 1,000 miles of this hillside. Someone walked in here, broke up the floor of an even deeper part of the cave, carried the broken pieces back, arranged them in 2 careful rings, and lit small fires inside them. No one knows why. No one will ever know why. The why has gone. What has not gone is the doing of it, the shape of it on the floor. The fact that it took planning, and torches, and people working together, and a reason that mattered enough to bring them down into this cold and silent place to do it. You can call that a ritual, if you like. You can call it a meeting place. You can call it a shelter, although it is not. You can call it almost anything you like. The careful researchers who have written about it for the last decade have been very careful not to call it anything in particular. They will say only what is true. 2 rings. Stacked stalagmite, small fires, 176,000 years old, made by Neanderthals. The rest is for you to sit with. You sit with it. It is worth saying, while you are still in the chamber, that this is not a single odd find. Other Neanderthal sites, in other parts of Europe, have started to give up similar quiet evidence. Bone fragments arranged in shallow pits, pigments carried far from where they could have been collected, fires built deep in places that were not lived in. The picture, in the last 20 years, has slowly shifted. The Neanderthals were not, as it turns out, a people who only ever crouched at the mouths of caves chewing on bones. They went into the dark on purpose. Sometimes, for reasons of their own, they came back out. They lived and they died, and they had reasons that we are only just beginning to read. When you walk back out of Bruniquel, in your mind, and out of the south of France, you should travel east, a long way east, across what is now Europe, across Turkey, into the foothills of what is now Iraq. The land is harder there, and the air drier, and the hillsides are more open. There is another cave in this country that you ought to visit. It is called Shanidar. Shanidar is a wide-mouthed cave in the Zagros Mountains. It is not a long thread like Bruniquel. It opens like a hand, with the morning sun catching the front of it. People have lived in this cave on and off for tens of thousands of years, and so have other kinds of people, and one of the other kinds of people is the people you are looking for now. The Neanderthal layers in this cave are deep. They go back, in places, to maybe 60 or 70,000 years before the present, and possibly more. And in those layers, in the middle of the 20th century, archaeologists began to find something they had not expected. They began to find bodies. Not killed and discarded, not eaten and tossed, not lost in a rockfall and left where they fell. The bodies, in some cases, looked as though they had been laid down on purpose, arranged, curled, sometimes on one side, as if asleep, with other bones animal, human placed in some careful pattern around them. The most famous of these is the man we now call Shanidar I. He is sometimes called the Old Man of Shanidar, and there is a reason for that. When the bones were laid out and looked at properly, it became clear that the Old Man of Shanidar was a person who had lived a very long time by the standards of his world, and that he had lived that long time despite being, on every reading, hurt. His left eye socket showed signs of an old, badly healed injury. He had probably been blind in that eye, or very nearly. His right arm had not, in his adult life, been a functioning arm. The lower part of it appeared to have been amputated, or lost, or atrophied. The long bones below the elbow are simply not there in the way you would expect, and the upper arm shows the kind of wasted thinness that speaks of a limb that has not been used for years. He had lost most of his teeth. He had a deep, healed wound in the side of his head. He was lame in one leg. He was, when he died, by every reading of his bones, an old man. And he had not survived all of that on his own. You cannot, if you are a one-eyed, one-armed, mostly toothless, lame Neanderthal, survive into middle age in the Zagros Mountains by yourself. You cannot bring down a deer with one arm. You cannot chew tough meat without teeth, unless someone, somewhere, is softening the food for you. You cannot keep up with a moving group on a bad leg, unless the group has decided, for whatever reason, to slow itself for your sake. The Old Man of Shanidar lived to be old because the people he lived with chose to keep him alive. That is the only sentence the bones support. They cared for him. They fed him. They walked at his pace. They did this by every reading of the cave strata for years. When he died, they buried him, and around the body of one of the other Shanidar burials, not the old man, but another, the one called Shanidar, 4 soil samples taken in the 1960s came back. When they were analyzed, with unusual concentrations of the pollen of flowering plants, cornflower, yarrow, hollyhock, the kind of bright, small, bunched flowers that you might, today, lay on a grave. The story spread quickly. The Neanderthals had buried their dead with flowers. You should slow down here, because the story has been argued about ever since. Some researchers, looking at the same evidence, have pointed out that pollen can get into a cave floor in many ways. There is, in particular, a small burrowing rodent in the region, the Persian Jerd, that is known to carry plants and seeds into its tunnels, and those tunnels run through the layers of the Shanidar floor. The pollen, on this reading, was not laid by mourners, it was carried by mice. Other researchers have looked at the spread of the pollen. the species of the plants, the way the flowers seem to have been clustered, and have argued that the pattern is not what a rodent would leave. They argue that some, at least, of those flowers were placed. The honest answer is that it is not settled. Some say the pollen came from rodent activity, others see deliberate placement. Both arguments are still alive, both have their evidence. You can hold the picture of the flowers gently in your mind, knowing that it might be true and might not, and either way, the rest of what is true about Shanidar the old man, the years of care, the laid-down bodies does not need the flowers to carry its weight. The care is in the bones. The bones are not in dispute. While you are sitting in this cave, in the soft morning light at the mouth of it, you should take in another thing about these people. Their hands. Their hands are not the hands of a brute. Their hands have made things you would not, on first glance, expect them to have made. Some years ago, a small block of black, sticky residue was found stuck to a stone tool from a Neanderthal site. The residue was studied carefully. It turned out to be birch tar, made by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen until the bark releases its sticky resin. This tar was used as a glue. It bound stone heads to wooden handles to make spears and knives that would not come apart in the hand of the hunter using them. This sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. To make birch tar, you have to heat birch bark away from open flame in a sealed environment at a controlled temperature for a careful length of time. Recent research has tried to work out exactly how this could have been done with the materials available: small earthen mounds, controlled smoldering, particular angles of the bark, and the working consensus is that this is not a trivial recipe. It is not the kind of thing you stumble into. It is not the kind of thing a single individual works out in a single afternoon. It is the kind of thing that gets passed down, mother to daughter, father to son, across generations, in the language, whatever language it was, of the people doing it. The Neanderthals were not, when they made birch tar, doing primitive chemistry. They were doing chemistry. Their hands knew the temperatures, the timings, the depths of bark, the way you and I know how to boil an egg without thinking about it. They had, somewhere in the long tradition of their people, the recipe, and they passed it on. You should also, before you leave the Neanderthals, take a moment to look at their walls. In several caves in northern Spain, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, Ardales, there are markings on the stone, lines drawn in red ochre, a ladder shape, a stencil of a hand, made by holding the hand to the wall and blowing red pigment around it, so that when the hand is pulled away, a perfect human absence is left behind. There are dots, there are patterns. They are not, by any standard, the great galloping bison of Lascaux. They are simpler than that. They are quieter. They are the marks of someone, in the dark, choosing to put a mark there rather than not. In 2018, a team of researchers used a particular dating method, uranium-thorium dating, of the thin calcite crusts that have grown over the markings to put a minimum age on these paintings. The numbers came back at more than 60,000 years old. In some places, more than 64,000. That is older than the arrival of Homo sapiens in that region of Spain, by every reckoning we currently have. If the dates are right, those marks were made by Neanderthals. The dates have been argued about ever since. Some researchers argue that the dating is wrong. They point out that the calcite crust does not always grow evenly over the painted surface, that contamination is possible, that the samples may have caught older calcite that had nothing to do with the paint underneath. Others, looking at the same evidence, say the dating stands. They say the method was applied carefully, that the controls were done, that the numbers are the numbers. As of recent research, the argument has not been closed. Both sides are still publishing. Both sides have their reasons. You can hold this one, like the flowers, gently. Some of those red marks on those Spanish walls may have been made by Neanderthals, in the dark, by torchlight, more than 60,000 years ago. Some may not. Either way, somebody who was not us was, at some point in the deep past, making marks on cave walls in the dark. Somebody, at some point, was choosing to leave a sign that they had been there. There is one last place you should visit before you leave them. In northern Spain, in a cave called El Sidron, 12 Neanderthals died together around 49,000 years ago. The cave preserved them well enough that, decades later, a careful team could pull genetic material out of their bones. What that team found when they laid out the family tree of the 12 people was something quietly stunning. They were a group, they were related. 3 adult men, 3 adult women, 3 teenagers, and 3 children including a baby, who would have been only a few months old when she died. The men, when their DNA was looked at, were closely related to each other. The women, on a different reading of the genome, were not. The most likely reading is that the men were the local family fathers, brothers, sons, and the women had come in from elsewhere. The group was structured. It was structured in a way that anthropologists recognize: men staying, women moving between groups. A pattern that human beings, in a great many places, in a great many cultures, have used. This was a Neanderthal family. This was a Neanderthal extended family. In fact, with everything that implies the shared meals, the shared sleeping arrangements, the children growing up under the eyes of multiple adults. The genome of the group has been studied for years now, and it carries, in its small accidents and its small inheritances, the same kinds of patterns that human family genomes carry. They were a people. They were not a population of solitary brutes. They lived together, and they raised their children together. And on the day they died, by whatever cause, there are signs in the bones of cannibalism by another group. But the why of that is a different and much harder argument. They died together. You can leave them there, if you like. You can leave the family at El Sidron, the old man at Shanidar, the rings at Bruniquel, the red hands on the walls of La Pasiega. You can pull the camera back, slowly, off the long, low forehead of the man you walked into the cave with, and let the image of him fade. He was not a failure. He was not, in any way that the bones support, less than you. He was a different kind of person who lived in a different kind of world for a great deal longer than you have, and he is gone now, and you are the one walking out of the cave alone. While you are walking out, you should walk east again, further east than Shanidar, past the Zagros Mountains and the plains of Central Asia, and the long, long step that runs in your imagination toward the rising sun. You are walking, in your mind, into a country we now call Russia, into a region we now call the Altai, into the southern foothills of a range of mountains that, if you stood at the top of them, would let you see, on a clear day, the edge of Mongolia. There is a cave in those mountains. It is not a famous cave. It does not have a chamber of stalagmite rings or a wall of red handprints. It is a quiet cave, in a quiet valley, by a quiet river. People still go to it. The local name for it is, in the Russian, Denisova. In the year 2010, a single small piece of bone was pulled from the floor of that cave. The piece of bone was the tip of a finger. the pinky finger of a young girl, by the look of it, around 8 years old at her death. The bone was tiny. You could have held it on the pad of your own thumb without feeling it. It had been in the floor of the cave for 40,000, possibly 50,000 years. It had been overlooked in earlier digs because it was so small. A finger bone is not a skull. A finger bone is not a tool. It is the kind of thing that, in a cave full of older and stranger bones, you almost do not see. A team of researchers in Leipzig took that finger bone and pulled DNA out of it. What they expected, when the analysis came back, was either modern human DNA or Neanderthal DNA. Those were the two kinds of people they knew of in that part of the world at that time. The cave had Neanderthal layers in it. It had layers used by sapiens. The girl, by the date and the place, had to be one or the other. The DNA, when it came back, was neither. It was clearly the DNA of a person of an upright, large-brained, late Pleistocene human being. It was not modern human. It was not Neanderthal. It was its own thing, a whole population, a whole branch of the family tree, sister to the Neanderthals on one side and to us on the other, that no one had previously known existed. A branch with its own deep history, its own genetic distinctions, its own millions of small accumulated differences, a whole people identified, for the first time in all of science, from the tip of one little girl's pinky finger. The team, having no name to give them, gave them a working name. They called them, after the cave, the Denisovans. That working name is still the working name. They have not, formally, been given a species designation. The arguments about what to actually call them, Homo something, Homo what, Homo when, are still going on. For now, in almost everything you will read about them, they are simply the Denisovans. You should sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. In every other case, in the long history of paleoanthropology, the bones come first. Someone finds a skull in a cliff face. Someone finds a jaw in a quarry. Someone finds a leg bone in a riverbed. The shape of the bone tells the story, and the story slowly builds, and only much later does the genome arrive, if it arrives at all, to flesh in the corners. With the Denisovans, the order was reversed. The genome arrived first. The genome arrived before the species had a face. We had the entire genetic outline of a whole branch of humanity, what their immune system looked like, what color their hair and their eyes were likely to have been, how long ago they last shared an ancestor with us, long before we had any idea what their skull was shaped like, or how tall they were, or how their arms moved when they walked. It was, in the history of this kind of science, a quietly upside-down moment. We met them, properly, only as data. We have never met them, really, as bodies. The bodies, since 2010, have come in slowly. A jawbone, found years earlier on the high Tibetan plateau, has since been reanalyzed and identified by the proteins in its teeth as Denisovan. A few molars, here and there, a skull cap, possibly, that has been argued either way, a handful of fragments, not a single complete skeleton, not a single confident face. The whole of what we have, in physical bone, of this entire branch of humanity, would fit comfortably into a small wooden box. This is, when you sit with it, an odd kind of haunting. Almost every other branch of the human family that you have walked through tonight is known, first, by its body. You can picture Antecessor by the shape of his face. You can picture Heidelbergensis by the heaviness of his brow and the length of his thigh bone. You can picture the Neanderthal at Shanidar lying on his side, with his good arm folded under his head. With the Denisovans, the picture refuses to come. You can know from their genome that they probably had darker skin than most modern humans, and dark hair and brown eyes. You can know that some of them, by the proteins in a single Tibetan jaw, had teeth that were noticeably larger than the teeth of the Neanderthals. You can know that they walked upright, because their cousins on either side did. Beyond that, the body is missing, the face is missing, the height is missing. The shape of the hand, the length of the arm, the way the head sat on the neck, all of it, for now, is missing. You are sharing the planet, in your imagination, with a population whose entire physical appearance is a blank. The geography of them, on the other hand, is enormous. When researchers started looking, in living people, for the parts of the genome that came from this newly identified group, the map that came back was not a small map. There is Denisovan DNA in living people in Siberia. There is Denisovan DNA in living people on the Tibetan plateau. There is Denisovan DNA in surprisingly large amounts in living people in the islands of Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, in northern Australia. The genetic shadow they have cast across the modern map runs from the cold mountains of Central Asia through the green forests of southern China, all the way down through the warm, scattered islands of the equator. They were, by every reading of that shadow, all over the eastern half of the Old World. They were one of the most widely spread human populations the planet has ever held. And we have, of all of that, one finger bone, a jaw, a few teeth, a cap of skull. The places where they actually lived, the caves they lit, the shelters they built, the hillsides they walked are, with very few exceptions, still unfound. What you do have, in their absence, is their inheritance. You have it because they did not all vanish without trace. They left their genes, in the way that all of these branches left their genes, by living long enough alongside their cousins to have children with them. The Denisovans, in particular, met our ancestors at some point in the long and complicated story of our species walking east, and the meeting was, by the genetic record, intimate and repeated. People living today, in certain parts of the world, still carry pieces of Denisovan DNA in their genome. In some populations, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, in parts of Aboriginal Australia, that inheritance is several % of the whole genome. It is not a trace. It is a substantial fragment of an entire other people, sitting inside the cells of people walking around now. And one of those fragments, in particular, has a story you should hear. If you go up onto the high Tibetan plateau, at 14,000 feet, you find a population of Tibetans living, working, raising children. In air that has only about half the oxygen at sea level, people not from there, going up onto that plateau, struggle, their hearts race, their breath shortens. They feel, for days, the kind of tired that does not lift. The Tibetans, in that same air, are fine. They have lived there for thousands of years. When researchers looked at the Tibetan genome to see what was different about them, they found a particular variant of a gene called EPAS1. That gene controls, in part, how the body responds to low oxygen, how much hemoglobin it makes, how the blood thickens or thins in altitude. The Tibetan version of EPAS1 is unusual. It does the job better, in low oxygen, than the version most of the rest of us are walking around with. It allows the body to live, comfortably, in air that would, over time, hurt the rest of us. When researchers looked at where that version of the gene came from, the answer was, at first, a surprise. It came from the Denisovans. Somewhere, somewhen, in the long story of the human family walking east through Asia, our ancestors met the Denisovans, and our ancestors had children with the Denisovans. And those children carried the Denisovan version of EPAS, one in their cells, and those children had children, and those children had children, and one of those long lines of descent went up onto the Tibetan plateau and stayed there. The Denisovan version of the gene, well suited to thin air for reasons we are still working out, became, in that population, the standard version. It is, today, what allows a Tibetan grandmother to climb a hill at 14,000 feet without thinking about it. That gene is the closest thing, right now, to a face. It is a thing the Denisovans gave us. A thing they did, in their own bodies, in the long, deep past, that you can still see in the running of the bodies of people alive now. They are not entirely gone. Pieces of them are still in the world. There is one more thing you should hear about the Denisovans before you leave them, and it concerns a girl who was not a girl. In 2018, a team of researchers, working again in Denisova Cave, looked at a small piece of bone called Denisova 11. It was a fragment of long bone from the upper or lower limb of a young female who had died around 90,000 years ago when she was about 13. They sequenced her DNA. What they found when the sequence came back was that she was not, in any clean sense, of one kind. Her mother, in the genome, was Neanderthal. Her father, in the genome, was Denisovan. She was not a distant hybrid. She was not a child of two distantly related groups whose ancestors had mixed 5 generations back. She was first generation. Her mother was a Neanderthal woman. Her father was a Denisovan man. They had met. They had a child. And that child had lived to be a teenager, in that cave, in that valley, before her bones, like everyone else's bones, were laid down in the floor. The team, in their writing, gave her the working name Deni. You should sit with Deni for a moment, because she carries something you can otherwise miss in this whole long story. These were not separate species in the way people sometimes imagine the word. These were not animals in a zoo, in different enclosures. They were peoples. They were peoples who lived in places, in the same valleys, at the same times. They knew of each other. They saw each other. They sometimes, by every reading of the genetic record, formed families with each other. Deni is not a strange exception. Deni is the small, surviving evidence of something that was probably, in some places and at some times, almost ordinary. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She lived a Neanderthal Denisovan life, in a Neanderthal Denisovan home, in a part of the world where both kinds of people were walking the same hillsides. She is, in your imagination, the small living point where 2 of the lost branches touch. Now you should pull the camera back from the Altai, the way you pulled it back from the Spanish caves. You leave Denisova Cave. You leave the long Russian valleys and the blue cold light over the mountain plateaus. You leave the genome that arrived before the species had a face, the gene that lets Tibetans breathe thin air, the small girl whose mother and father were 2 different kinds of people. You leave the Neanderthals back in Spain, and the family at El Cedron, and the old man at Shanidar, and the carefully placed stalagmite rings under 300 meters of French limestone. You move south. You move toward the warm parts of the world, toward sun on water, and palm trees, and small green islands sitting in long blue stretches of sea. The story so far has happened in caves. It has happened in cold places and damp places and places under heavy stone. The branches you have not yet met do not live in caves. They live in the imagination, on islands. They lived on islands for a very long time. They became, on their islands, smaller and stranger than anyone, looking only at the European cousins, would have guessed. The boats, for whatever reason, came in. The sea levels fell, and rose, and fell, and the islands of Southeast Asia became, for one branch of this family, a whole world. A small, hot, green world, full of pygmy elephants and giant rats and forests dense enough to lose a body in. A world in which, by every reading of the bones we have so far, a kind of human grew shorter and shorter and shorter until they were no taller than a child. You should walk slowly in that direction now. You should walk slowly in that direction now. The island in the modern atlas is called Flores. It sits in the long chain of islands that runs east from Java, past Bali, past Lombok, past Sumbawa, out toward Timor. It is mountainous in the middle. It is green almost everywhere. It has volcanoes that smoke at certain times of year, and small rivers that run down to the sea, and beaches that face out across deep water in every direction. It is, even now, one of those places where the land feels older than the people on it. In the limestone hills of Flores, there is a cave. It is not a famous cave the way Lascaux is a famous cave. It does not have paintings on the walls. It is large and dry and high-roofed and cool inside even when the day outside is hot. Locally, the cave is called Liang Bua. The name, in the Mangarai language of Central Flores, means, more or less, the cool cave. You should picture, for a moment, what it looks like. You walk in across a packed earth floor. The roof of the cave lifts away above you into a long curve of pale stone. There is light from the entrance, a soft yellow light that fades as you go further back. You can stand up in it. You can walk a long way in it. The cave has been used by one kind of person or another for an extraordinary length of time. Generations of people have come into it to shelter from rain, to cook, to sleep, to die. The earth floor of the cave is not really earth at all. It is layer upon layer of everything those people left behind. In 2003, a team of Australian and Indonesian archaeologists were working in this cave. They were digging, slowly, the way archaeologists dig, into the floor. They were not looking, particularly, for a new kind of human. They were looking for evidence of how the modern people of Flores had reached the island, and when, and what they had eaten. Down at about 6 meters below the floor, in a layer of soft earth, they came upon a skeleton. The skeleton was, at first, very confusing. It was an adult. The bones of the pelvis, the wear on the teeth, the closure of the skull plates, all said adult. But the skeleton was tiny. The leg bones were short. The skull, when they lifted it carefully out, was the size of a grapefruit. The whole person, when she had been alive, would have stood about 1 meter tall, roughly the height of a modern child of 3 or 4. For a long time, in the early days of the discovery, the team kept the find quiet. You can understand why. They had found, by every measurement, an adult human being who had lived on this island, who had been the size of a small child. Her brain, when they later measured the inside of her skull, had been about 400 cubic centimeters, about 1/3 of yours. About the size, more or less, of a chimpanzee's brain, and yet she was, in every other detail of her body, not a chimpanzee at all. She had a flat face. She had small, closely placed teeth. Her hand, when they reconstructed it, had a precision grip. She had walked upright on two legs in the human way. Her hip, her knee, her ankle, all said two-legged walker. Around her, in the same layers of the cave floor, they began to find more, not whole skeletons, but fragments, a jawbone, a radius, a piece of skull, the remains of, eventually, perhaps a dozen individuals scattered through different layers across a long stretch of time. The first skeleton, the most complete, was given the catalogue label LB1. In the press, in the years afterwards, she became known by another name. She became known as the Hobbit. You should set the word aside for a moment, because the word does her a disservice. She was not a small character in someone's story. She was a person. She lived on this island. She walked this cave. She ate and slept and looked out at the volcanoes in the distance, and, by the layers her bones were found in, she may have died right where her skeleton lay down. The team gave her, formally, the name Homo floresiensis, the Flores person. When the discovery was published, the argument about her began almost immediately. There were researchers who said, looking at the small brain and the strange proportions, that she could not be a separate species at all. They said she must have been a modern human with some pathology, some condition that had stunted her growth or shrunk her brain. The argument went back and forth in journals for years. People published and counter-published and re-examined the bones and proposed conditions: microcephaly, cretinism, Down syndrome, endemic dwarfism. But over time, as more bones came out of the cave, the argument shifted. Other individuals showed the same proportions, the same small skull, the same long, flat foot, the same wrist bones in the same archaic shape. You do not, ordinarily, find a whole population of people in one cave who all happen to have the same rare disease. What the cave was showing, slowly, was not a single sick individual. It was a stable, settled, long-lived community of small people, people who had been small for a very, very long time. The leading explanation now is that her ancestors arrived on Flores, somehow, more than 700,000 years ago, that when they arrived, they were of normal size. Probably some early form of erectus, or something like it, the kind of body that had walked out of Africa, across Asia, by some route now lost, and then they were stranded. Flores, you should understand, is not easy to reach. The currents around it run hard. The straits between the islands of Southeast Asia are wide and deep and busy with tide. To get to Flores, even at the lowest of low sea levels in the deepest ice ages, you had to cross open water. Whatever sat on that island was cut off. Whatever sat on that island had nowhere else to go. When you put a population of large mammals on a small island and you leave them there for hundreds of thousands of years, something happens to their bodies. Biologists have been observing it for a long time. It happens to elephants. It happens to deer. It happens to hippos. The animals get smaller. They get smaller because the food on a small island is finite, and a smaller body is cheaper to feed. The phenomenon has a name. It is called insular dwarfism, or, more poetically, the island rule. On Flores, in those long, long stretches of isolated centuries, the elephants got smaller. There were stegodons on Flores, an extinct kind of elephant relative, and the stegodons of Flores became, over time, no taller than a large pony. There were giant rats on Flores. the size of a domestic cat. There were Komodo dragons, vast lizards that did not need to shrink because they were already large enough to dominate everything else. Flores became, in the imagination, a kind of strange enclosed garden, a place where the rules of body size were quietly rewritten by the size of the island itself. And the people on that island were not exempt. The people on that island, slowly, generation by generation, century by century, also became smaller. Their brains became smaller. Their bodies became shorter. By the time, perhaps 100,000 years ago, that the layers of Liangbua were being laid down, they had become what you find at the bottom of the cave, a metre tall. 400 cubic centimeters of brain, a face as flat as yours but a body the size of your own knee-high child. You should stay with her for a moment, because there is one detail in the cave that asks you to. In the same layers as her bones, the archaeologists found stone tools, not crude tools, not the tools of a being with a chimpanzee's brain. The tools at Liangbua are small, sharp, carefully struck flakes. They are tools you can hold between a finger and a thumb. They are tools that someone has shaped, deliberately, by hitting one stone with another, again and again, until the right edge has come away. In the same layers, the archaeologists found the bones of Stegodon, often the bones of young Stegodon, often with cut marks on them. She hunted them. You should let that picture form. A person, a metre tall, with a brain the size of an orange, in this green island world, watching a herd of pony-sized elephants come down through the trees in the late afternoon. A small group of others like her, hidden, with sharp stones in their hands, the light failing, a young Stegodon at the edge of the herd. A long, slow stalk through the leaf litter, the strike, the shouting, the carrying back, in pieces, to the cool cave with the high pale roof. The fire at the cave mouth in the evening, the smell of cooking meat, the small bodies sitting close to the flames, eating. You imagine her looking up at the volcanoes in the distance, the volcano of Inari, perhaps, or the smoke of Ebulobo, the sky going pink, then purple, then dark, the stars coming out over the small island, the other adults, the children, the elderly, all the small people of Liangbua, sitting in their cave at the edge of the world. This was not the most powerful kind of human there had ever been, but it was, by every reading of the bones, a kind of human that had lasted. They had lasted on Flores, in some form, for hundreds of thousands of years. They had not needed a large brain to last. They had needed only their island, and their stones, and each other. The latest dating of the layers in Liangbua suggests that the small people of Flores were still there, still hunting, still lighting their fires, until perhaps 50,000 years ago. Possibly a little later, by the time they disappear from the layers of the cave, modern humans, the kind of people you are, had begun to arrive on the islands. Whether the two ever met, on Flores, in the hills outside the cave, no one yet knows. The bones we have do not say. Recent research by a team working further west on the island at a site called Mata Menga has found older fragments, tooth, jaw, and arm bone, from perhaps 700,000 years ago, older than Liangbua by many lifetimes, already small, already on the path to becoming what would walk into the cool cave hundreds of thousands of years later, with the small flake tools in her hand. She is the deepest island echo in this story, a lost branch that came inland on a piece of land that was already, by then, very far from anywhere else, and who simply, in the way of small isolated places, became her own kind of person, in her own small place, for a very long time. You should leave her now, with the smoke of the cooking fire still going at the cave mouth, the volcanoes still standing in the distance, the cave still cool and dry and quiet in the heat of a Flores afternoon, somewhere in the long afternoons of 50,000 years ago. You move further north and east, across the sea, to another island. This one, in the modern atlas, is called Luzon. It sits in the northern Philippines. It is large and tropical and mountainous and densely forested over most of its center. The interior is hot. The interior is hard to walk through. It is the kind of place where, until very recently, almost no one bothered to look for old bones. In a cave called Calao, in a limestone hill on Luzon, in the years between 2007 and 2019, a small team of Filipino and French researchers were quietly working. They were digging, layer by layer, through cave sediments. They were finding bones of deer, of wild pig, of small mammals. Then they began, very slowly, to find pieces of person. There were not many. There were, in total, a handful, a few teeth, some finger bones, some toe bones, a piece of femur, from at least 3 different individuals. From layers dated to more than 50,000 years ago, and possibly as old as 70,000, too old, too far away, too odd in shape, to be modern people, too small, in detail, to be anything else they recognized. In 2019, the team published the find and gave it a name. They called the species Homo luzonensis, the person of Luzon. You should sit, for a moment, with how little there is. There is no skeleton, there is no skull, there is no whole hand, no whole foot. There is, by the standards of human discovery, almost nothing at all. There are some teeth, which are oddly small, with old-style cusps, and there is a curved finger bone, and there is a curved toe bone, and there is a single piece of upper leg. What the bones say, when laid out together, is that someone lived on this island 50,000 or 70,000 years ago, who was small, who was in some ways like Floresiensis far to the south, but was not the same. Their teeth were different. The proportions of their fingers were different. The ankle was different. They had, in the curve of the toe, an odd, archaic feature, as if part of them had still belonged to something older, something that climbed, something that moved easily through trees. That is most of what can be said about them. There is no Liangbua-style story to tell about Luzonensis. There is no scene, around a fire, with a stegodon. There is not enough to imagine even one face. The bones say only that they were here. They were on this island. They were a separate kind. They lived and ate and died, and most of what they were is now silent. You should let yourself notice the shape of that silence, because there will be more like it. Most of what these other branches were, you will never know. There were probably more lost branches than the ones with names. There were almost certainly populations on islands and in valleys whose bones have not yet been found, and whose bones may never be found, and whose lives have left no trace at all. The people on Luzon, in their cave, are, in this story, a deliberate moment of quiet. They lived here. That is most of what can be said. You should stay quiet with that for a moment, in the green Luzon dark. Then you should travel south again, back through the islands, toward Java, because Java holds, in its riverbeds and its volcanic terraces, the longest single arc of any of these branches. You should remember the early branches you walked through at the start of all this. Antecessor in northern Spain, Ergaster in eastern Africa, the earliest forms of what was once called erectus, walking out of Africa into the Caucasus, then on into Asia, sometime around 2 million years ago. They left bones at Denisovans in Georgia. They left bones at Zhaokudian near Beijing. They left bones in great quantity on the island of Java. The Java erectus story is, in many ways, the longest of all the human stories. Erectus, in some form or other, walked the earth for nearly 2 million years. They were the first members of this family to leave Africa. They were the first to live in cold places and warm places and mountain places and island places. They survived through climate cycles longer than your imagination can really hold. By the time the Neanderthals had lived their entire arc and disappeared, erectus had already been on Java for more than 1 million years. And on Java, possibly, they outlasted all of them. There is a site on the Solo River in central Java called Ingandong. In the 1930s, a Dutch survey team excavated a terrace of the river and found the skull caps and leg bones of about a dozen erectus individuals. They were strange skulls. They were thicker walled than older erectus. They had heavy brow ridges. They had the mark, everywhere on them, of a population that had been on the island for an extremely long time. The dating of the Ngandong terrace has been revised, repeatedly, over the decades since. The early dates put the Ngandong people at perhaps 50,000 years ago, which would have made them contemporary with sapiens. Later work has pushed the dates older. The most recent careful work suggests they may have lived between perhaps 120,000 and 100,000 years ago. Old, but not as recent as once thought. You should hold the dates loosely. The point is not the exact number. The point is that, for nearly 2 million years, this kind of person walked the world. They lived through ice ages and warm ages. They walked across continents. They reached islands. They survived on Java after every other erectus population had vanished from anywhere else on Earth. They were, on this island, the last remaining members of a way of being human that had begun in Eastern Africa, before the first stone tools you have a name for were ever struck. Whether the last of them ever met sapiens on Java, the bones do not yet say with certainty. What can be said is that they ended on an island, the way Floresiensis ended on an island, the way Luzonensis ended on an island. The last of them, whoever they were, looked out from a riverbank in central Java, perhaps, at the volcanoes, at the long brown river, at a kind of world they had been part of for the longest time of any of you. And then, the way the bones say, they were gone. The line that had begun in Africa 2 million years before ran out on Java, in the heat, in the dark. You should let the islands close behind you now, the way the sea closes behind a boat. You move back to the larger continents. You move back, in your imagination, to the African mainland and to the country in the modern atlas called South Africa. In 2013, a recreational caver named Stephen Tucker squeezed himself with a friend through a narrow crack in a dolomite hill north of Johannesburg. The hill is part of a system of caves called Rising Star. The cracks they were squeezing through were so narrow that, in places, you have to exhale fully to fit through. You let the air out of your lungs and you slide. If you have any breath left in you, you do not fit. What they came out into, after that long sliding crawl, was a small chamber deep in the hill. They had a torch. They lifted it. Around them, on the floor, were bones. They were not the bones of cave bears or bats or any animal they recognized. They were the bones, by every detail, of person. They came out, and they told a researcher named Lee Berger. Berger looked at the photographs they had brought back, and he understood, almost immediately, that he was looking at something for which he was the wrong shape. He was, at the time, too large to fit through the cracks himself. He could not even reach the chamber where the bones were lying. He put out a call. He put out a call for what he described as caving scientists. People with the qualifications of an anthropologist and the body of someone who could fit, sideways, through a 15-centimeter crack in stone. From all over the world, 6 women applied and were chosen. They became known, in the team, as the underground astronauts. Over a series of expeditions, between 2013 and 2014, they crawled, by the thin light of head torches, into the chamber far underground, and they began, over hundreds of hours of careful work, to lift the bones out. What they brought out was extraordinary. More than 1,500 individual fossil pieces from at least 15 different individuals of every age: adults, adolescents, young children, infants, all of them, by detailed comparison, the same kind of person, a kind of person that did not match anything previously known. The team, when they had finished the first round of analysis, gave the species a name: Homo Naledi. The word Naledi, in the Sotho language of southern Africa, means star. They were the people of the rising star. Naledi, by their bones, are a strange combination. Their brain is small, smaller than yours, by a long way, perhaps 500 cubic centimeters, less than half of what sits in your skull. Their hand is curved at the finger, like a creature that still spent time climbing. Their foot, by contrast, is almost identical to yours. Long, with a longitudinal arch built for walking. Their teeth are small, like yours, but their jaw is heavier. Their hip is wide, like an older form. Their shoulder is built like a climber. They are a mosaic. They are pieces of older bodies and younger bodies set into the same person. For a long time, when they were first found, people assumed they must be very, very old. The body looked old. The brain was small. The proportions were archaic. You would have guessed, looking at the skeleton, an age in the millions of years. Then the dates came back. The chamber, when carefully dated, was not millions of years old. It was somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 years old, which means that Naledi was not an ancient ancestor. Naledi was a contemporary. Naledi was walking around the same hills of southern Africa at roughly the same time the earliest forms of your own species, sapiens, were walking around the same continent. A small-brained, climbing-shouldered, walking-footed person, sharing a continent with the earliest beings who would one day be you. There is, in the chamber itself, a question that has not been settled. The chamber where the bones were found is, by every measure of the cave system, very hard to reach. It is not somewhere a body falls into by accident. It is not somewhere a flood drags a body into. It is, even today, a place you reach only by squeezing painfully through narrow cracks in absolute dark, far from any opening to the surface. The floor of the chamber, when you reach it, contains only Naledi bones. There are no other animals. There are no signs of carnivore damage on the bones. There are no signs that the bodies were dragged in by anything else. The team, looking at this, proposed something cautious. They proposed that Naledi may have been carrying their dead, deliberately, into this deep chamber, that they may have been depositing them there, on purpose, that this was a place where, for some reason, the bodies of their own people were placed. This is evidence that is still disputed. Other researchers have looked at the same chamber and proposed other explanations. A different cave layout in the past, a flood event we cannot now reconstruct, a sequence of accidents. The argument is ongoing. The team has, in the years since, also proposed that Naledi may have made marks on the cave walls and may even have used small fires to find their way through the dark passages. Those further claims are also contested. There is no consensus yet. What is not contested is that this is real. The bones are there. The people are there. A small-brained kind of human, contemporary with the dawn of your own kind, lived in southern Africa, climbed in trees, walked on the ground, and ended their lives, somehow, deep in the dark of a cave that even now is hard to reach. You should leave them in their dark chamber now, by the thin light of head torches, the careful gloved hands of the underground astronauts, the bones in their long resting place, 250,000 years ago. The hill above them, full of the same dolomite, full of the same cracks, full, for all anyone knows, of more chambers no one has yet reached. You move back to the surface. You move back into open daylight. You move, now, toward the question that this whole long story has been quietly walking toward. Where did all these other branches go? The first thing to say is that they did not all simply die. That is the picture you get, sometimes, in older school textbooks. A picture of one species replacing another, like one wave on a beach replacing the wave before it. The new arrives, the old vanishes, the line of descent moves cleanly forward. That picture, by everything we now know from genetics, is wrong. The branches did not just die out. In some places, in some moments, they joined. In 2002, in a cave called Pestera Q Oas in Romania, a team of cavers found a human jawbone in a deep gallery. The cave had been sealed for a long time. The jawbone, when it was eventually dated, was about 40,000 years old. It was, by every detail, a sapiens jawbone. It was your kind. The man it belonged to was given, in the literature, a working name. They called him Oase 1. When his DNA was eventually sequenced, more than a decade later, the result was something no one had expected. His genome was, overall, a sapiens genome. He was, in all the ordinary senses, a modern human. But within his genome, there was a much higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA than ordinary modern humans carry. Around 6 to 9% of his genome, by the analysis of the team that sequenced him, came directly from Neanderthals, not from a deep ancestral mixing thousands of years before. From Neanderthals, very recently in his line. The team, looking at how his Neanderthal DNA was distributed, came to a conclusion that you should sit with. Oase 1, the modern man in the Romanian cave, had a Neanderthal great-great-grandparent, possibly a great-great-great-grandparent. Within 4 to 6 generations of his birth, by the structure of his genome, one of his direct ancestors had been a Neanderthal. Picture that, for a moment. Picture this man, walking, perhaps in a small group, across the cold grasslands of late Ice Age Europe, perhaps with a fur cloak, perhaps with stone-tipped spears. He looks, in any photograph you could imagine, like a person you would recognize. He is a man. He is your kind. And in his bones, in his cells, very close to the surface, is a great-great-grandfather who was not your kind at all. A great-great-grandfather who had the heavy brow ridges, the broad chest, the cold-built body, the deep voice perhaps, of a Neanderthal man. That meeting was not, by every reading of the genetic record, a one-off accident. You should think about it as a longer pattern. the story of sapiens leaving Africa somewhere around 60 or 70,000 years ago and moving up into Western Asia and then north into Europe and east into Asia and on into the islands of the southeast and across into the Americas was not a story of arriving in empty land. The land was not empty. The land had Neanderthals in it and Denisovans in it and possibly other branches, and your ancestors met all of them. Recent research, including a 2024 study that looked very carefully at when Neanderthal DNA entered the modern human genome, has placed the main pulse of Neanderthal interbreeding at around 47,000 years ago. A specific window, perhaps a few thousand years long, during which sapiens populations leaving Africa met Neanderthal populations in Western Asia, lived among them, formed families with them, had children with them, and carried those children's children onward into the rest of the world. It was not a single moment. It was a period, a long time of meeting. The Denisovan story is similar, but on a different stage. Sapiens populations moving further east, into South Asia, into the islands, met Denisovan populations along the way. They too formed families. They too had children. They too carried those children onward. The result of all of this is something quietly extraordinary. It is something inside you. If you are a person whose ancestry comes from anywhere outside Africa, on average, between roughly 1 and 2% of your genome is Neanderthal. It is not spread evenly. Different people carry different stretches of it, but across your whole ancestry, you are carrying, in the cells of your body, the DNA of those people from the European caves, the El Sidron family, the old man at Shanidar, the carriers of the carefully placed stalagmite rings. If your ancestry includes the islands of Southeast Asia, particularly Papua New Guinea and parts of Aboriginal Australia, you also carry Denisovan DNA. Up to about 5% of the genome of a modern Papuan, by the most careful analyses, is Denisovan, from those people whose finger bones sat in a Russian cave for 90,000 years, from the molars in the mountain. From the world we have almost no faces for. Their lines did not simply end. Their lines walked, partly, into yours. You should let that sit very gently for a moment. The other branches did not vanish into nothing. The Neanderthals are not gone. The Denisovans are not gone. Pieces of them are sitting quietly inside almost every person on Earth whose ancestors left Africa. The dark eyes, the immune cells, the way some of you process fat or tolerate altitude, the small shapes of your bones, the pace at which your blood clots, the way your skin responds to ultraviolet light. Some of those things are not strictly only sapiens things. Some of those things are gifts or simply remainders of meetings that happened tens of thousands of years ago in places you will never see. The lost branches are, in the most literal sense, in you. The other branches end, but they end the way a river ends when it joins another river. The water is still there. The line is still there. It has only, at some point in the long darkness, run together with other water and gone on under a different name. You should let the camera pull back now, the way it has pulled back before. You leave the Dolomite Hills of South Africa and the small dark chamber of Rising Star. You leave the Romanian cave with its single sapiens jawbone and the Neanderthal great-great-grandfather. You leave the islands of Southeast Asia, the cool cave on Flores, the silent layers of Callao, the long Solo River and its terraces. You leave the long winter steppe of Central Europe and the warm coastal caves of Spain and the long green forests of Heidelberg and the high cliff faces of Atapuerca, and the small valley in the Atlas. You move back, in your mind, to where you started. You started, hours ago now, looking out across a wide green valley, in the early morning, 200,000 years ago. You watched, from a distance, the small smoke of a cooking fire and the small upright figures around it. You did not know, then, who they were. You knew only that they were not you, and they were not no one. By now, you know more. Some of those people around that fire, in that valley, were Neanderthals. Some, in a different valley, somewhere further east, were Denisovans. Some, on a hot green island, were a metre tall and watching pygmy elephants come down through the trees. Some, in a cave deep underground, were carrying their dead by the light of small fires through cracks no one larger than a child could pass through. Some, on a long brown river in Java, were the very last of a line that had begun in Africa nearly 2 million years before. Some, in the cold of northern Spain, in the cool of an old cave at the foot of a long limestone cliff, were the people of the dawn, the antecessors, watching their breath in the air at sunrise on a world without anyone yet who would write any of this down. They were 8 kinds of people. They lived in different places, at different times, with different bodies, and different brains, and different small fires, and different kinds of stone in their hands. They walked on every continent except Antarctica. They reached islands by means we still do not fully understand. They survived ice ages and warm ages, eruptions, droughts, and the slow grinding return of the glaciers. For most of the time that there has been any kind of human on this planet, there has been more than one. For almost all of human history, you were not alone. And then, somewhere in the last 40,000 years, one by one, the others ended. The Neanderthals of Spain were gone. The Denisovans of the Altai were gone. The small people of Flores were gone. The small people of Luzon were gone. The last erectus on Java were gone. The Naledi in the dark were gone. The antecessors had been gone for a long time. The Heidelbergensis from whom so many of them had come had been gone for longer. By somewhere around 20,000 years ago, by every honest reading of the bones we have, there was, on the entire face of this planet, only one kind of person left, your kind, sapiens. You were, at last, alone. But it was a strange kind of alone, because in your blood, in the marrow of your bones, in the small turns of your immune system, in the texture of your hair, in the color of your eyes, in the way you breathe in thin air, in the way your skin carries cold, were the others. They were inside you, even then, around the small fires of 20,000 years ago. They are inside you now. You are not, in any clean sense, a single line. You are a confluence. You are what is left at the place where many rivers met. That is the truer picture. Not a single line that survived, but a single line that absorbed, in its long walking, pieces of every other line it met. The names you have been listening to tonight, Antecessor, Heidelbergensis, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Floresiensis, Luzonensis, the last of erectus, Naledi, are not strangers to you. They are, in every meaningful sense, your relatives. They are the cousins and great-aunts and great-grandfathers of your line. Some of them, like one's relatives, were closer than that. They are part of how you came to be standing wherever you are standing now. There is no triumph in this. There is no moment, in the bones, where you can say that one of them won and the others lost. There were only people, in different places, in different shapes, doing what people do, lighting fires, caring for the old, burying the children, sometimes with small flowers, in the deep limestone, looking out in the late afternoon at the volcanoes, or at the long curve of a glacier on the horizon, or at the soft yellow light of a cave mouth, and doing what you do, almost without thinking. When you do that, wondering, remembering, going back inside, for almost the whole of human time, there were others, and then the others slowly ended, and what was left behind walked on, carrying them. They were here. They are in you. You are not alone in being human. You never were.